Uliwan Belabuzzel, the good Lustigok, Chiwaji Badji, a good Ludway Wagonal, Skijimi Bomout Wagonal, Gaki the Wagonal. I want to welcome everyone to traditional Lustigway territory. The first teachings of this land, of course, are the Lustigway teachings. The first language of this land is the Lustigway language. The ceremonies that were practiced here on traditional Lustigway territory. So I want to acknowledge that we're on traditional Lustigway territory. I have the honor of introducing our guest speaker, our keynote speaker for this morning. And just a couple of thoughts before I introduce Dr. Pam Palmater. I just wanted to reflect on our ancestral thinking of treaties at the time. And back in those days, our ancestors believed that if Wabanaki signed treaties with other nations, you add that nation to the Wabanaki family. So basically, you are all Wabanakis because you're part of the family. It's important to recognize that historical fact because as Dr. McLean mentioned, we're all treaty people. And as treaty people, we should know one another and also know the treaties of this land, the rights that were recognized, and the responsibilities that we have because of the treaties. Another belief of my ancestors is that when they signed those treaties, they were actually protecting their way of life. It wasn't just the simple activity of fishing and hunting. It was all of the related activities with that. So fishing and hunting were basically part of the cultural foundation. So it was a protection of our way of life. So it is, when you look at those treaties, it's just a matter of protecting treaty rights, hunting rights, fishing rights. And another point that I'd like to emphasize also is that for my ancestors, these were sacred agreements. Creator acknowledged these agreements, these treaties, nation to nation. The treaties is about a relationship of equality. Wabanaki nations were recognized by the British Crown. So it's important to also remember that point as well. So I've shared my thoughts on that. So now I'll introduce Dr. Pam Palmater. Dr. Pam Palmater is a Mi'kmaq lawyer, author, social justice activist, and chair in Indigenous governance at Ryerson University from Eel River Bar First Nation in New Brunswick. She has 4 university degrees, including a BA from St. Thomas in Native Studies, an LLB from UNB, and her master's and doctorate in law from Dalhousie University, specializing in Indigenous law. Pam has been volunteering and working in First Nation issues for over 25 years on a wide range of issues like poverty, housing, education, Aboriginal and treaty rights, and legislation impacting First Nations. She was one of the spokespeople and public educators for the Idle No More movement in 2012-2013 and has continued her public advocacy in many forums since then. She has been recognized with many awards for her social justice advocacy on behalf of First Nations generally and Indigenous women and children specifically, including the 2012 YMCA Woman of Distinction Award in Social Justice, the 2012 Women's Courage Award in Social Justice, Bertha Wilson Honor Society 2012, and Canadian Lawyer Magazine's 2013 Top 5 Most Influential Lawyer in the Human Rights category. Canada's Top Visionary Women Leaders 2014, and the 2015 UNB Alumni Award of Distinction. Her books, Indigenous Nationhood, Empowering Grassroots Citizens and Beyond Blood, Rethinking Indigenous Identity, and legal articles, academic journals, magazine articles, and invited news editorials focus on Indigenous law, politics, and governance. She is a well-known speaker and media commentator and is frequently called as an expert before parliamentary and United Nations committees dealing with laws and policies impacting Indigenous peoples. Her most recent work focuses on police racism and sexualized violence against Indigenous women and girls. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Pam Palmater.
And I can run downstairs really fast. Hi, my name is Pam Palmater, and it's an honor to be back home amongst my family and my friends and everyone from the Mi'kmaq and Maliseet Nations, and of course here at UNB. I want to thank the people that were involved in the ceremony and the sacredness of the drum and the pipe, and everyone who made sure that this event would be grounded in our culture and traditions, which are in fact part of our laws. And in order to maintain our laws and in order to maintain and live treaty, we have to constantly reinforce that. So that's really important. And thank you to the organizers and UNB for keeping the focus on treaties so that the public doesn't keep thinking that these are ancient documents that have no relevance today, that they are in fact the very basis of our relationship. And that's really important moving forward. We're talking about the treaties of 1725, 1726, 1749, 1752, 1760 and 61, and any other documents that may be recognized as treaties on a go-forward basis, and all of those informal agreements that never made it pen to paper. But the promises that we made to each other as nations to live together peacefully, and not just in peace and friendship, but also mutual prosperity, mutual protection, and mutual obligation to protect the lands, the waters, the plants, the animals, and every part of the system in which we are a part. It is not just human beings coming together and making an agreement. The treaties are really about all of the living beings, all of the ancestors that came before us, and all of the future generations that are yet to come. We are all existing here at the same time. And so I think it's so important that UNB and the nations here on this territory continue to acknowledge those treaties. And as important as they are not the entirety of who we are. Keep in mind, Mi'kmaq and Maliseet nations have been here from time immemorial. We pre-exist treaties, we pre-exist contact. Our very connection with the land long precedes treaty. Treaty is but one aspect of the relationship. It's one aspect of who we are. But first and foremost, we are sovereign Mi'kmaq and Wolastoq nations on unceded territories over which we have a huge responsibility. And that's really important, because then that takes away, it strips away anything that courts could possibly do to detract from our treaties, and thereby detract from us as nations. They don't have the power to. And that's important because so many times when I have come to treaty conferences or treaty discussions, the conversation starts out with, the Supreme Court of Canada said in this, the Supreme Court of Canada said in that, and that is not where the discussion begins. It's actually grounded in our own laws. The spirit and intent of the treaty is the law. Mi'kmaq law, Wolastoq law is spirit and intent. What is the intention of these treaties? And it certainly wasn't just hunting and fishing. And hunting and fishing is important. Our ancestors sacrificed and they negotiated with very specific purpose to make sure that our heirs and their heirs forever would always have those rights recognized, not granted, but recognized and protected. So they are important. But there's so much more to those treaties and to this relationship than just hunting and fishing rights. These treaties, simply by fact of their existence, recognizes our status as sovereign nations. It recognizes that this is our territory, and nothing was going to happen here without our say-so. That's significant. And it's something that we don't necessarily talk about today, because sometimes we get hung up on what does sovereignty mean in international law, in European law, in American law, in Canadian law. But that's the wrong question. Is what does sovereignty and independence and self-determination mean in Mi'kmaq law or Wolastoq law? That's what's important. And there's nothing in our legal definitions of sovereignty that prevent us from entering into treaties with other nations and maintaining relationships. In fact, we have a precedent for that. We have the Wabanaki Confederacy, where the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, Passamaquoddy, Abenaki, we all work together. There is literally hundreds of pre-contact, intertribal, internation treaties and confederacies based on our laws to work together that never surrendered an inch of land or a right or sovereignty. In fact, it would be a fundamental turning upside down of law to interpret the signing of treaties as a surrender of sovereignty, because the treaty in and of itself can only be signed between nations. It's a fundamental aspect of international law recognized by states world over. Citizens and subjects don't enter into treaties with states. Nations enter into treaties with other nations. And that's why this is called a nation-to-nation relationship. That's why the Royal Proclamation talked about us as nations. That's why court cases have already recognized not just the limitations on how they would like to interpret our treaties, but that in fact here in this territory, without treating with Mi'kmaq and Wolastoq people, there would have been no peace. There would have been no settlement. So Canada and these provinces and territories only exist because of our sovereignty. Canada's assertion of sovereignty only exists and is fully dependent on our actual sovereignty. And this is something that's critically important when we're talking about treaties or land claims or anything else that could potentially impair our Indigenous nations. So I think any conversation around treaties has to start way back before those treaties were signed, where we recognize ourselves as sovereign, as inherently sovereign, and that our laws and rules have never been displaced. And this is why what I want to talk to you today about is a little different focus on the treaties. We've talked lots about hunting and fishing. There's been lots of conflict over whether or not we have a right to fish and sell it, or to hunt and sell it, or to chop down trees and make ourselves a house. But we haven't talked so much about the critical aspects of that treaty recognition of our sovereignty. Take, for example, the issue of national security. Whenever there's a discussion around the Senate or Parliament on national security, you won't see any Indigenous people. And when I did testify, they were shocked and had zero questions to ask. They couldn't imagine why an Indigenous person, a representative from the sovereign Mi'kmaq nation, might have something to say about national security. national security in terms of all of Turtle Island, but more specifically, Mi'kmaq national security. And these treaties hold this gem within them of issues like trade and lawmaking and national security and nation building that we need to bring to the forefront. Because it's important to remember, Mi'kmaq and Wolastoq people were never conquered. Never, no matter what any Crown lawyer might try to argue in a maritime court and apologize for afterwards. We were never conquered. We were never defeated in a war. And that's not because they didn't try hard. Even after signing peace and friendship treaties, can you imagine, after signing peace and friendship treaties, to issue scalping bounties on our heads? But we didn't return the favor. We honored our treaty obligations because that's Mi'kmaq and Wolastoq law. Canada absolutely depends on our peace between our sovereign nations. Those treaties, in fact, form the very basis of Canada's legal existence. They are protected in Canada's foundational document, their constitution. They're protected in Section 35. They're literally founding documents of this country. But they're not just protected there. They were first protected in our laws, then protected in Canadian laws, and now recognized internationally as fundamental laws and rights that must be upheld by democratic governing states. And failure to do so calls their entire democratic system and own sovereignty into question. Canada can never call itself a legitimate state on the international forum unless it also recognizes our sovereignty. The safety and well-being of everybody in this territory has always depended on Mi'kmaq and Wolastoq people acting peacefully and honorably and in a helpful way. We have always looked out for the safety and well-being of not just Mi'kmaq and Wolastoq people, but all of the people in this territory. Why? Because we promised to do so. That was a sovereign, sacred commitment made between nations, and those things aren't broken easily. You wouldn't find Canada and US renegotiating the border very easily. Just like our treaties, there is no end date. It's forever and ever and ever for our heirs and heirs forever. And we lived up to our end of the bargain in every single aspect. We took care of the settlers, we took care of soldiers, we took care of those who were shipwrecked on our shores. We have, beyond all reason to me, continued to hold out our hand to federal and provincial governments and say, no matter how many times you have screwed us over, we still want to work with you in peace and friendship. Our ancestors who had that forethought, far more honorable than I, but they have demanded that that's how we proceed. We've also defended Canada in its wars that weren't in Mi'kmaq or Wolastoq territory, but which had the potential to threaten settlers' rights here in our territory. So our people signed up in far higher numbers than any other group in this country, both in Canada and the US, to defend settlers because we promised to do so in the treaties, and we lost our lives doing so. That's pretty significant. But Canada and the provinces have consistently failed to live up to its part of the bargain. And what is that bargain? Each of the treaties say something different. Not all First Nations have treaties. They have other agreements or informal agreements. But they all boil down to three basic tenets. Mutual respect. And when I say respect, I am not talking about being nice to someone. I'm not talking about taking a selfie with someone. I'm talking about respect in the legal term, where you respect the sovereignty and self-determination and law-making powers of the other sovereign with which you have an agreement. That's what respect means. And mutual prosperity. That's the other core tenet. Yet Canada and the provinces have often, sometimes through violent and lethal force, blockaded us from accessing our own traditional economies, our trade networks, or our traditional practices. And they have taken all of the benefit and made sure that we have suffered all of the consequences. That's not mutual prosperity. That's not anything even remotely like it. And then the one that I have focused on in the last couple of years is the one on mutual protection. We promise to protect one another. We've done our jobs and we continue to do our jobs. Every time we stand on the front line to defend lands and waters in New Brunswick from hydrofracking or irreparable environmental harm, it's not just for Mi'kmaq-Wolastoq people, because poison water impacts you too. It's for all of us. Yet can we say the same in terms of mutual protection? Who's standing up to stop murdered and missing Indigenous women? Who's standing up to stop the provinces from stealing our children and placing them in foster care? The treaty relationship isn't just about benefit, it's also mutual obligation. For every right we claim we have, there's a corresponding obligation. I can't, in good faith, say that I have a right to fish in a river that I won't also stand and defend the health of. That's what real treaties are about. And about mutual protection, let's look at the Treaty of 1725. We mutually agreed to forbear all acts of hostility, injuries, and discord to the Crown's subjects. And I think we've done a pretty good job. We also agreed to maintain an ongoing friendship with English and never confederate with another nation against the interests of the English. And we haven't done so. Thank goodness we are not united with Trump. That wouldn't be so good for our country. We promised not to do so, and we won't. The Treaty of 1752, different provisions, but it reaffirms those previous treaty commitments. And Her Majesty promised all favor, friendship, and protection for us if we would forego hostilities. Well, we have foregone hostilities. I don't see Her Majesty's favor, friendship, and protection. We also reconfirmed an exclusive trading relationship. In theory, New Brunswick and Canada really shouldn't be trading with anybody else. We have that exclusive one-stop truck house trading stop. That's for us. And that trading wasn't for a moderate livelihood or some other way that a court wants to diminish it. In fact, that trading relationship was to the best advantage of the Mi'kmaq-Wolastoq people. Best advantage. Not mediocre, not lowest, not lower in priority behind anyone else. Best advantage. And that is constitutional promise. Best advantage. I feel like I need a t-shirt when I go into courtrooms to remember them. This is what our treaties say. But on October 1st of every year, Mi'kmaq and Malseet people are supposed to receive presents, tobacco and blankets, but more importantly, guns and ammo, powder and shot. Every single Mi'kmaq and Malseet person is owed decades of guns and ammo. And why is that? It certainly wasn't for hunting and fishing. No, No, it's because we agreed to be military allies. That's what sovereign nations do. Our nations will unite against any threats, and in so doing, we will give you guns and ammo to do that. I have half a mind to sue them for my guns and ammo, but they already think I'm a terrorist. That's significant. What does being a military ally, what does armed protection imply? It implies territorial security, national security, not just for our territory, but for the English, but for what would become Canada. We should be at every single table on national security, and there should in fact be one here. We should be the ones in charge. We should be the ones in charge. 1760, 61, same thing, reconfirmed the peace. And just for clarification, they also said, where there are disputes, where there are conflicts, we won't take revenge on one another. We'll find a way to work it out. And this is what we have been trying to do. But instead of working with us as partners in national security, our own treaty partner has become itself a threat to Mi'kmaq national security and Wolastoq national security. And this is where we have to get real, because the scalping bounties of the 1700s came after we signed those peace and friendship treaties. And it was a good example of how one nation used their laws to legalize the murder of their treaty partners in violation of treaties that they signed, targeting not just men, not just warriors, but also the women and children. So that implies something a little bit more. That's a little bit on the genocide side. That's the physical killing of people. Children serve no threat. But national security, as far as the settler government was concerned, meant protecting colonial interests in Mi'kmaq and Wolastoq lands, and resources and trade routes. All of a sudden, the very same trade routes we showed these governments became blockaded to us to use. Some of the most profitable trade routes in all of Turtle Island, right from Canada all the way down to what is now Mexico, blockaded from us. But we resisted. We refused to surrender while still abiding by our treaty obligations. That's a very difficult thing to do. So from then on, colonial governments decided, if we can't get rid of them all from scalping bounties, if they refuse to surrender, we will criminalize every aspect of what it means to be Mi'kmaq and Wolastoq, every aspect. Early versions of the Indian Act outlawed our ceremonies and dances, which are also our laws and our ways of being. But what did our nations do? We hid our regalia and we danced in secret to make sure that we could pass it on to our future generations. We became criminally Mi'kmaq, criminally Wolastoq in the eyes of our treaty partners, in the eyes of their laws that they created. We became criminals in our own lands, and we literally had to break settler law to exist. Not to have a benefit, not to have a right, but just to exist, we had to break the law. After separating our nations into tiny communities so that we couldn't come together and resist on a much larger scale, our traditional forms of government were replaced with Indian Act forms of government. And they created laws and policies such that they will only deal with those that they recognize, or they will put you into third-party management and control your community anyway. So here's your choice. Agree to be controlled by us, or be controlled by us. And that's not much of a choice. And that has been the catch-22 for us for all of these long years. Constantly going back and forth between agreeing to be controlled or being controlled, agreeing to be controlled or not being controlled. Yet, the traditional Mohawk and Haudenosaunee governance forms continued despite this. They continue alongside Indian Act leadership. The Mi'kmaq Grand Council continues alongside. There are forms of resistance all over the country where we haven't given them up. They have been interfered with, but we have never given them up. And it is still there. It's held. Our traditional forms of government are held in the people. They're the ones that keep it alive. What do you think Idle No More was? That was us, the power of the people, the real governments coming forward and saying, you're not alone anymore, Indian Act leader. It's kind of hard to fight a battle when you're the only one standing on the front lines. We can't do it without one another. And we tried to resist these discriminatory laws. We've tried in so many different ways. So they made it illegal for us to hire lawyers under the Indian Act. We couldn't even bring our own claims forward. We couldn't even advocate on our own behalf as sovereign nations. And intermarriage, although it was completely encouraged to promote trade and to promote integration, they also had a really dark side to it. And that was to banish Indigenous women and children from our nations. And why is that? Because we always had positions of power. We were also warriors, leaders, life givers, politicians. But if you take away half the strength of a nation, it makes it far easier to defeat. And that's part of the problem with our nations today. We're out of balance. We're out of balance because of how Canada treated us. And don't forget, despite our treaty rights to hunt and fish and to trade to our best advantage, they enacted laws and regulations and policies to criminalize any one of us who dared hunt or fish, even if it was just to support our family to bring home supper. How many times have you or your family been stopped by natural resource officers, your equipment seized, threatened to be charged in court, vehicles seized, and this continues to happen despite Canada's own courts recognizing that we have these rights. We are treated like criminals. We are forced to skulk around the woods like criminals, but we do it anyway because it's a part of who we are. It's an assertion of sovereignty to continue to do what we have always done. Think of how many families broke the law when the RCMP or Indian agents came knocking on their door wanting to steal their kids and put them in residential schools. They made us criminally Indigenous in just trying to protect our children from those death houses. Criminally Indigenous just to survive. And now in modern times, people might say, well, that was in the past. Well, I would put to you, since time immemorial, many Indigenous nations had the traditional practice of growing, manufacturing, and trading in tobacco all over Turtle Island. But they criminalized that too. They criminalized our economy. They now call it contraband. And we're criminals if we trade in tobacco. Gaming. We have literally done that for thousands and thousands of years. But they purport to criminalize us for that too. And this is an offense to our sovereignty. Yet, when we stand up to defend our lands, or defend our rights, or defend our treaty provisions, they again treat us like criminals. You're arrested, you're beaten, you're maced, you're thrown in jail. And if you survive that and live another day to go on the front lines, then you're called a terrorist. And you're publicly vilified. We had a former Minister of Indian Affairs who had the audacity to call First Nations leaders threats to national security. I have not seen a massive terror event come from an Indigenous nation ever, but I've seen the reverse. We've lost millions. We've literally lost millions. Yet, when our people are at risk, how quickly do they forget the treaty obligation of mutual protection? Where have they been for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls? Where have they been for all of our kids that are stolen and put into foster care, that are caught up in child porn rings? Where have they been when their own police officers are engaged in child porn rings, child sexual exploitation rings, and, in fact, murdered and missing Indigenous women? Where have they been? So criminalizing us and not even giving us the protection of their other laws has put us in a very precarious position. Now even our own poverty is used against us. If you are poor, you are considered criminally unfit to take care of your kids. And they can take your kids away from you under their laws. That's not what these treaties were about. We're grossly overrepresented in Canada's prison systems, and according to their laws and their Supreme Court of Canada decisions, like Gladue or Ipeely, there has been a direction to all of the courts in this country to stop incarcerating Indigenous peoples. That case came out about 10 to 12 years ago, and guess what? In the last 10 years, we have never had such a dramatic increase in the number of Indigenous peoples being in prison. The number of women, Indigenous women, going to prison has increased by 85%. The fastest growing prison population in this country are Indigenous girls. What kind of threat could little Indigenous girls possibly be to this country? Except maybe they'll testify about who's involved in murdered and missing Indigenous women. Or maybe they'll testify about what happens to them in foster homes, and in hotel rooms, and in group homes. Maybe that's why we're not looking at that under the inquiry. But our families struggle to provide food on the table. Who has the time to think about issues like national security? When you don't have enough food, when you don't have a babysitter, when you're worried that someone is going to take your kids and put them in foster care. Now, even the ways that we resist are vilified. The Department of National Defense's counterinsurgency manual shockingly references Indigenous people. And not just that, but considers us to be insurgents. And why? Because here is how they define acts of insurgency. Trying to occupy your land, seeking autonomy for your people, cultural protection, and wanting political control. These are acts of insurgency according to Canada's military. That's why it shouldn't be a shock about when Oka happened, or when the SWAT team was called out in Elsipogtog, or when the RCMP and DFO were called out in Esconobidage. Because this is how they view their treaty partners. And I would love to say that this is in the past, but this is the right now. This is the reality we need to deal with if we're going to talk honestly about treaties. It's not all handshakes and smiling faces. We have some pretty serious issues in this territory. Yet, despite everything that they have done to try to suppress us and force us to surrender and literally give up, not just as a nation, but as individuals, to break our spirit, we haven't. We refused. We're still Mi'kmaq Mulstuk people. We're still here, and we're still proud of who we are and what we have. We have kept the peace even when Canada brought conflict to our nations. That's honorable. We have protected settlers even when they didn't return the favor. We have honored our treaty commitments even when Canada failed to live up to its promises. We have made our ancestors proud, those same ancestors who are walking right along beside us even in the face of injustice, broken promises, and genocidal acts of violence. But we now have to shift the focus inward. As much as we put focus into resisting colonization, resisting assimilation, and resisting oppression, we have to put as much focus into rebuilding, nation building, and nation rebuilding, and re-healing, and revitalization, and reconnecting, and putting balance back in our nations. We have to put just as much effort there. We can't just be protesters. We also have to be nation builders to change this. We're the only ones that are going to change this. I think we've looked to our partners for a very long time to make changes. May or may not happen, but now it's incumbent on us. The Mi'kmaq Nation has a responsibility to do this for its members. The Wolastoq Nation has a responsibility to do this, because at the end of the day, you will never be able to look to a court case in Canada or any other court where someone says you have a right to sovereignty. Because sovereignty doesn't work that way. Sovereignty is asserted, it's lived, and it's defended. And the minute you stop defending it, you don't have it. Because it's not a right, it's a way of living. And we live as nations, collective sovereign nations. This is going to require a substantive, fundamental, monumental shift in how we do things and where we're going. There is no way around it. It's going to hurt and there's going to be conflict, but it is the only way to change this ship around, turn this ship around. Legal, political, social, cultural practices in the Mi'kmaq Nation and Wolastoq Nation are going to have to change. We are going to have to restore this balance. But it's going to require us, all of us, to realize and accept that we are sovereign and we are self-determining and we have the right and the responsibility to make all of these choices going forward. And it's also going to require something very, very difficult on an individual level. It's going to require that we forgive ourselves for all of the ways that we have been colonized. Because it is not our fault. We have to live with it, we have to find a way to move past it, but it is not our fault. So when we are divided into status and non-status, on reserve and off reserve, man and woman, elected leader, not elected leader, none of that comes from us. It impacts us, it causes conflict between us, we judge each other on it. You can speak the language, you can't speak the language, you went to residential school, you didn't go to residential school. But that's not going to cut it going forward. We are going to have to move beyond all of those individual issues that we have adopted through colonization and agree to set that aside for now. You know, I cannot like you later because you didn't grow up here. What matters right now, though, is that we protect and defend and grow the Mi'kmaq Nation. That's what matters. It doesn't matter that you hate your chief because he's so terrible. Or there's a counselor who just did terrible things and gave everything to her family and not anybody else. Because they were all a part of us, they were all equally colonized, and they have all suffered the same as us. We need to get around that and move forward in terms of nation building, because that's what living the treaty is. It's not our fault that our warriors have been treated like terrorists, and now some of us look at them like radicals and dangerous. It's not our fault that there's a divide between Christians and traditional. It's not our fault that women were kicked out of the Indian Act and were looked at as traitors, and now we see them as something lesser now. Those things aren't our fault, but it's our responsibility to get over it. And it's an unfair burden, and I wish we didn't have it, because nation building is hard enough. But we're also going to have to get through all of these individual things as well. But here's the good news. In all of Canada, we are supremely unique. There is not a single document here that can even allege that we surrendered our lands. These are all Mi'kmaq and Willistok lands. They are unceded territories. We have Aboriginal title, Indigenous title, Mi'kmaq and Willistok title to these lands. Unfettered. As well, we also have constitutionally protected Aboriginal and treaty rights. As well, we also have international rights under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and a whole bunch of other international conventions. We have the most amount of power and force behind us. We should be dictating what happens in this territory. That's how powerful we are. We should be dictating what happens in this territory. And we can. Because we have the power. We've always had the power. Look at the amazing things that happen when we get together. Canada, the first Prime Minister Trudeau wanted to enact the 1969 white paper, which would just wipe everybody off the face of the earth. We didn't have any funded organizations then. We didn't have honorariums. We weren't driving around in trucks and SUVs. We relied on bologna sandwiches and 20 Indians in a car driving around the country to go to protest to oppose this. We had no social media, no cell phones. It was old school, but we did it and we were successful. And look at how the Mohawk warriors inspired us in Oka. They refused to give up when the QPP, the RCMP, and army tanks were pointing at them. Those are the kinds of things that we need to hold on to. Look at what happened in Elsipogtog. When everybody, the national media, was just looking at Elsipogtog saying, what can they do? What can these protesters do to stop hydrofracking? But when the protesters and the treaty partners got together, and they all stood in defense of the land, even though they were arrested, even though it looked on the news like a failure, what happened? Our treaty partners voted that government out of power. There isn't anything that we can't do. There really isn't. If individuals like Donald Marshall Jr. can spend a decade in jail, wrongfully imprisoned, and come out and still be Mi'kmaq and hopeful enough to go and protest fish to prove that we have a right to fish and sell it. Oh my goodness, why couldn't we do that? As students and faculty and community members and leaders. Think of the sacrifices that he made. We are literally a living nation on sovereign, unceded territories with all of the protection of the laws behind us. We need only use it. And now that sounds a little simplistic. True. Not every community is working in a way that's working towards the Mi'kmaq nationhood or Willistok nationhood. Not every leader is working in that direction. But we cannot forget that the real government is the people. So our nation is bigger than any one leader. And when we demand accountability, that's the best chance of getting accountability. Resigning ourselves to, this isn't working, they will never listen, I'm the only one at this meeting raising my hand, I am the only one protesting. I'm sure that's what they thought at Elsie too. And then it was 4 people and 5 people and 6 people. Look at what happened with Idle No More. It organically sprung out of nowhere. But it wasn't really nowhere because it was always inside of us. We just needed a little bit of inspiration. So we can do that. We can require more of our leaders. We can start that today. It's going to require that we also demand more of the provinces and the federal government. That everything that is not working for us, every table, every initiative, every meeting, every stall tactic they use to not address our fundamental rights, you pull out of it. Because the only way it has legitimacy is if you're in it. Imagine if the Mi'kmaq Nation or Willistok Nation pulled out en masse from negotiations that weren't working for us. Imagine. given that we're the landowners, that's pretty significant. But it's also going to require a lot of courage to see behind and beyond the people that we don't like and the people that we can't work with, beyond all of the judgments that we have inherited from colonization. It may mean foregoing per capita payments for populations in the right now to protect our rights in the long term. It may mean that. It may mean pulling out of these processes, whether it's provincial, whether it's local, whether it's national, even if they sound good, even if it means giving up an economic development project. Because at the end of the day, our lands and waters are the most valuable thing for any human being, any living thing on this earth. Minerals aren't going to last forever. Oil and gas isn't going to last forever. Makes a small number of people a lot of money in the short term. But there's going to come a point where what humans and animals need is living land and clean water. And that will be priceless. So why on earth would we give that up for a few houses now, or for an economic development project, or for a seat at a table where you can be an advisor? None of it is worth selling out. And our treaties recognize this. So I'm saying, why don't we risk being sovereign? Why don't we risk asserting our nationhood again? What do we have to lose? Given everything that's happened so far, honestly, what do we have to lose? The Supreme Court of Canada cases have gone from Sparrow, where Aboriginal rights had priority over everything else, down to we are now the lowest priority after everything else. Economic development, historical interests, valid legislative objectives, so on and so forth. The solution is not going to be in their courts. It never was in their courts. It was in the agreements we made through these treaties. And here's the thing. Here's why this matters to settlers. Because Indigenous peoples, our nations, are literally the last best hope at guaranteeing a future for your children. Because we are the ones with the laws, with the constitutional rights, with the treaty rights, and the international rights to make decisions over what happens over our lands and waters. That's a huge shield, a protective shield to have. But you can't win a war with a shield. You need a sword. And it's the people, it's the settlers, it's the treaty partners who are the sword, because you have the numbers, you have the education, you have the power, the wealth, the influence. You vote people in and out of power. Imagine if we put those two things together and did treaties the right way and guaranteed ourselves a future, because this is what we're talking about. And we can, and I believe, in fact, that we will. Times are changing. Idle No More changed a lot of things. It was a partnership between settlers and Indigenous peoples, a powerful partnership that hasn't ended. And I say, if Mi'kmaq and Wolastoq people as nations can survive all of the genocidal acts that have been thrown at them and still extend their hands to you in peace and friendship, who else would you rather have by your side as a military ally? And it's not just me saying that. David Suzuki, a famous environmentalist and scientist, said it's not going to be conservationists that save the world. In fact, it's going to be Indigenous peoples. And why? Because lands and waters aren't a commodity, because we are willing to die for it. So while we have our bodies on the line protecting the lands and waters in this territory, all our settlers need to do is stand beside us. We have always been willing to take the hard hits to protect settlers. Now we're asking settlers to stand up and advocate on our behalf. Because we have a responsibility to live up to the promises of your ancestors and ours. And we have the precious responsibility to protect the future for all of our future generations, to make sure they have a future, that they can breathe, drink water, and eat food on this territory, and still see animals and birds and fish. That's our responsibility. But I believe we can do it because the law that governs our treaties are based on spirit and intent. And so long as we uphold those laws of spirit and intent, there isn't anything we can't do to turn this around. So I'm upholding the spirit and intent of the treaties, and I hope that you will as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pam. We're going to take a, can we do a Q&A?
Sure.
Sure? Okay. We're going to take some questions and from the audience, have some questions. We've got a question in the back. So we don't have a mic, so we may have to speak up. Okay. I'm really glad you asked that question because I get a lot of questions around reconciliation. You'll notice I didn't mention the word at all in my speech because reconciliation has been co-opted to mean everything other than what I'm talking about. Reconciliation has come to mean if you have a native tattoo on your arm, all is good. If you invite an elder to your meeting to open it up, all is good. And putting our artwork in buildings, putting our artwork on money, ironically money that we don't get. That's not reconciliation. I think there's a misunderstanding that reconciliation or repairing this relationship, because that's what it is about. It's like you said, it's not creating a new one. It's going to be uncomfortable, and it might even be very painful. And if it's not, then we're not in the process of reconciliation, because reconciliation means undoing the very unjust, discriminatory, oppressive, racist relationship that exists. And that's going to mean a transfer of power, a transfer of wealth, transfer of decision-making, a change in how we relate to one another. And there's a lot of people who won't be okay with that. But the good thing is that there's a lot of people who are. Ever since Idle No More and in more recent times, we literally have non-government organizations, civil society organizations, human rights organizations, and other groups around the world stepping up
making sure that we can get to the UN and make our presentations, helping us fund research, a whole manner of things. People bequeathing their land in their wills to local First Nations. I mean, if I have a choice of what kind of reconciliation I want, it's definitely not a land acknowledgement. The most insulting thing a politician can do is stand up here and say, welcome to Woolastook territory. You don't have it. We do. What I want a politician to get up and say is, this is Woolastook territory, and here's all of the parcels of land we're giving back. That's reconciliation. And so we have to keep in mind why the resistance, because settlers have been colonized too. They've been colonized to think that we're terrorists, that we're greedy, that we get everything for free, that we're just no good for nothing, that we're usable, that we're dispensable. And it's going to take a long time to get a lot of people out of that mindset, but I see a huge shift. I do. I see a huge shift, and I think that they're going to help us get through these painful times, because it's going to be painful for all of us if it happens. Yeah, it should be.
Any other questions?
Ma'am, as you know, I've been involved in Aboriginal politics for over 40 years. I don't believe the process that we're engaged in will ever work. But the process did work for 3 organizations that people will say, oh, you can't be doing the ANC, the PLO, and the IRA. What did they do? They killed innocent human beings, women, children, men, they didn't care. Now, what do they have? Actually, they have a say in their own country, their own law. They have a say. We don't. And when I went to the Minister of Indian Affairs, Andy Scott, who was from this, said, Andy, we've been doing this for years. Years. We showed you what's wrong, what's been done, why don't you do something? He looked at me and he said, Frank, we don't have to. There's nothing there that tells them they have to. Oh, here's the IRA, the ANC, the PLO, violence, our answer. Is it? I don't know. I'm sort of leaning towards that, but I'm an old man with a bad foot, so I don't think I'm going to lead a whole bunch of people to war.
Okay, full disclosure, that's my insane brother. So he always asks these questions, but it's a good question. And it's actually a question I get not in public, but behind the scenes all the time. Okay, we've been doing this peacefully. This isn't working. So what now? And I say our biggest problem hasn't been about force. When we come to territory or water or to protect rights, we don't bring guns to the table. They do. Not us. However, the biggest weapon we have is our choice. Now, it may sound simplistic, but I've seen it work in territory after territory in this country because I work with First Nations all over the country. The minute you pull out of a process that isn't working for you, they come running to the table wanting something else. Court cases sometimes work, sometimes don't. It's a bit of a crapshoot. We have a far better chance in controlling what we say we will do and what we won't, what we buy into and what we don't buy into. And the worst thing that anyone could do in this territory of unceded Mi'kmaq and Woolastook lands is to sign a specific land claim. And you know why? It may come with money, it may come with per capita payouts, it may come with economic development trust funds or education trust funds, all good things. But it requires that you cede and surrender your interest in that plot of land. And don't think for a minute that Canada isn't doing its very darn best to force you into or buying out your sovereignty and your land rights all across this country. That's why they are so anxious to get rid of the Indian Act and start negotiating agreements, because for all of those agreements, you must cede and surrender. There is no amount of money worth it. I don't care if it's an acre where there's a hydro line on it, and it would be more convenient just to surrender that land and get a couple $1 million. How about you keep your land and you tax them and you make decisions over what gets there and what doesn't and what services you'll have and what you don't? That's far more powerful, and that lasts in perpetuity. So it's things like that. Hit them where it hurts. And violence doesn't hurt them, it hurts us. We die, we go to jail. I mean, they've got the military. Where it hurts for them is in the power and the wealth and our taking our sovereignty back, because it means that they don't get this free fettered decision making and money anymore. And we have more and more people on our side. So I think that's far more powerful.
You have a question?
Thank you. Because you're from Ryerson, I'm sure you've heard a lot. Hugely powerful. I'm wondering if you would give
Well, it could be an Indigenous university outside of UNB. A completely independent First Nations University of Canada, a completely independent Arctic University of Canada. It could be any one lifting up and empowering and promoting and supporting any of the institutions, the First Nations Technical Institute in Ontario, where they try to provide courses to First Nations. It doesn't have to be within current structures. So we need to look at it as a clean slate. Okay, well, maybe it actually means a First Nation organization as well as an Indigenous president and 50% of the faculty being Indigenous and 50% of the research money going to Indigenous peoples. Because there's a lot of indigenization where you hire 1 or 2 faculty, you put up artwork, you do land acknowledgements, really good things. You have an Aboriginal Education Committee. You do all of these kinds of processes without fundamentally changing what happens, what gets taught, who gets the research money and who doesn't. Even at the best universities that I provide advice to on this topic, it's still playing around the edges and not looking at the fundamental problem. Like every single Indigenous person who wants a university education should be sitting here. There's nothing stopping the university from paying for that, the province from paying for that, just because of the federal-provincial jurisdictional divide. Ontario now pays for First Nation tuition. Everybody has a responsibility, and I think the less we look at what's already in practice, because we tend to circulate what's already been done, committees and adding a little bit of Indigenous content. Why don't we have some radical Indigenous content? Why don't we make it mandatory for people, including engineers, to take? Why don't we get to people before they become so solidified and before they become prime ministers and politicians and everything else? Let's get to them early. That's what I did to my kids. They are brainwashed. They're good. I don't have to worry about them. And here's the other thing, and it doesn't relate to university, but I just wanted to say, because some of my heroes are sitting here. Senator Sandra Lovelace-Nicholas, who is from Tobic, who was one of the first women to fight gender discrimination in the Indian Act. We need to hold those people up. We're still fighting to get rid of gender discrimination in the Indian Act. Or Marilyn Poitras, who was a former commissioner on the National Inquiry, who had the courage and bravery to say, I am not going to do this colonial process and hurt families. Imagine the courage that takes, and the amount of criticism that she would get, and negativity. We have so many heroes. We need to hold them up.
Other questions?
Yes, we just compare ANC, which I suppose is referred to South Africa. And in South Africa, the good things is that every kid learns 3 languages. The schools, the English and one of the indigenous language. I think we need to move first on the education system here and have every kid at school learning 3 languages. The English, French, and one of the local Indian things. This will make the next generation open to all your realities. Because language is the vector of the culture, and this wording is coming from President Mitterrand, France, speaking to Reagan. So it's very important that everybody and the young generation learn 3 languages. And mandatory for the 3, this will be one of the things we can work together.
Yeah, and I agree. I think long-term, Canadians should be speaking the Indigenous language of wherever they are. But I think the crisis facing us right now is the fact that there's 97% of our Indigenous languages that are at threat of immediate extinction. So every resource and support should be put into every Indigenous child knowing his or her own language, every Indigenous family having that offered to them as well. As that's the first step. And then we get to share it once we've saved it. But it's not going to be here. These languages simply won't be here to implement a wonderful vision like yours if we don't save it first. And it's saved in the language speakers.
Another question?
What is your comments about the Nunavut story? Nunavut was, the Inuit were able to do this self-determination and create their own government and so on without taking the weapon. And so what is your idea about
Here's the thing about Nunavut. It's often referred to as a self-government agreement, but it's in fact a public government. It is de facto has lots of Inuit people there, but they are still grossly underrepresented in positions of power in Nunavut. And the other bigger problem is Nunavut is an agreement that yet again the federal government isn't complying with. I mean, Nunavut representatives testify on a regular basis that Canada isn't respecting its financial obligations, its legal obligations, its shared decision-making obligations. So I'm worried about entering into any more agreements without first realizing the commitments that we have on the ground. I wouldn't call it directly relevant to this scenario, but some people might differ.
Do you have any other questions?
Okay.
And I've been with the Maliseet Advisory Committee on Archaeology since I was in high school in 1995. And this is the lead of the committee here. And I'd like to honor her as one of the fighters in the community. And I would like to honor Ramona Nicholas and Terry Nicholas for fighting me out in the Sisson mines and being there for our community and our rights.
Well, I'd like to, first of all, convey my appreciation to Pam for her wonderful, inspiring presentation. The points you made with regards to what we have to do here at the university as well is, I'd like to ensure that we follow up on those particular points, because it's important that we go beyond, the changes that are being proposed now, and make it happen so that we will have that sovereignty in place here within our territory. So as our expression of appreciation for your presentation, we have a gift for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.